Our learning target, just to remind ourselves, says, I can explain how tensions over power and authority led America's founding fathers to develop a constitutional democracy. We looked at yesterday. The American Revolution wasn't in and of itself truly revolutionary. There's always been people who have rebelled against government. There have always been people who protest. But the idea that the colonies threw off a monarchical form of government. Now, when I use the word monarch or monarchical, what am I talking about? That's a fancy term. Who was the head of England's government? A king, right? We call that a monarch. And that form of government is called a monarchy, right? So all throughout the, 13, 14, 15, 1600s, there was this whole idea that a monarch had a divine right to rule. I'm trying to think of what the technical term for it is, but it's slipping my mind, right? But essentially, the monarch said, you know what? God said that I have the power to rule, and therefore I have authority over you. And they had these monarchical lines. And power, how was power passed in a monarchy? Through your family, right? Hereditary. Now the problem with genetics is that sometimes you get a leader who's from the shallow end of the gene pool, if you know what I'm saying, right? For example, Louis XIV of France was a great king who did great things for France. Louis XVI, who's the king during the French Revolution, not a very good king at all. In fact, he's such a bad king that the people take him and he's ultimately beheaded during the French Revolution because they come up with this new invention called the guillotine, which they like to overuse, but I digress. All right? So, we have, during this time, during the late 1600s, early 1700s, we have some guys who are hanging out over in England and some guys who are hanging out over in France, and what they're doing is they're writing books, right? They're writing pamphlets. But the thing about them, we call them philosophers, because they're sitting there thinking about new ideas and new ways of running government. So we call this the Enlightenment. And if you think, somebody earlier talked about Buddha, right? And if you come in Buddhism into enlightenment, then how would you explain that?
Your mind would be calm.
Yeah, your mind will be calm, you understand things, you're able to reason things. That's exactly what's going on during the Enlightenment, all right? So there's this whole idea of the scientific revolution. In the 1600s, 1700s, there's a shift to human thought, to human reason. And people say that if you can't reason, then it doesn't necessarily exist, right? But the only things that exist are the things that are tangible, the things that we can understand, okay? You have scientists, which you don't need to worry about these guys, but people like Rene Descartes and Sir Isaac Newton, who are coming up with brand new theories on how things work, right? Newton comes up with things like the laws of motion and whatnot, which you'll study about in physical science. And so, the thing about the Enlightenment is we have a shift from religion, okay? If you think about the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, right? But Martin Luther, the one who nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church and split away from the Catholic Church, right? Most of European society focused on religion, specifically Catholicism, all right? And Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox religion. Well, we have the Protestant breakaway in the 1700s. Well, during the scientific revolution and during the Enlightenment, you see a breakaway from religion, which is a huge thing because people are saying, no longer are we going to really rely on faith, which is the substance of things that are unseen, right? But instead, we're going to rely on human reason. And we're going to try to figure out all of society's problems and how man can live contently with one another through reason. All right? They looked at growing economic opportunity, this whole idea of mercantilism that we talked about, the idea that you you sell more than you buy, you export more than you import in an effort to make money. And so the Enlightenment focused on how are we going to make man truly happy. And these Enlightenment philosophers, their way of thinking is that we can institute laws within our society. We can organize our knowledge into a rational system, a way of understanding things. And these individuals, people in our society, can understand this. They can become enlightened. And then we'll be able to live harmoniously with one another. All right? This is an obtainable goal. This is something that can happen if people understand these laws that we institute. So science and reason in this time period of the Enlightenment, they, as the philosopher saw, were the key to the future. And they shifted away from religions. All right? So that's the important thing to know. That's the philosophical aspect of this. And we'll get into something that's a little bit more applicable. So we mentioned we have these philosophers who are shifting into studying society, right? How are we going to make sure that mankind can live harmoniously with one another, all right? So we have two different guys that you need to be familiar with. Number one is a gentleman named Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes and Locke I throw under the same general category, but you need to be familiar with John Locke as well. Now, this is not the same John Locke as you watched on Lost, okay? Different guy. Which, by the way, I could never get through Lost and finish that. I got to season 5 and they got weird. Their time jumping and craziness, all right? But they came up with a scientific approach for a way to study man. And we're going to talk about how their theories were applicable and how their theories are seen within our government today. So Thomas Hobbes, and Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu are the four that we're going to talk about in terms of the Enlightenment. Adam Smith comes around when we talk more about economics. But you need to make sure that you're familiar with these guys, and we'll do a little bit more of an activity here with them later. So I know this is a lot of information. Don't let it overwhelm you. But focus down on bullet point number 3. Okay? Thomas Hobbes, he believed ultimately that man's nature was selfish and that man's nature was competitive. And this belief rooted out of the different wars that were occurring over in England during this time. And he said, you know what? People are fighting for selfish reasons. They're competitive. They want to win. And so he attempted to turn politics into science and said that man can be predicted to an almost mathematical accuracy if you believe that they are ultimately selfish and ultimately competitive. Men are motivated by a desire for power and by a fear of other men being in power. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So he believed that all men are selfish, all men are competitive. They're going to do what they believe is in their best interest.
No, the part where they're
Yeah. All right. So he said that men are motivated by the desire for power, and so they need something sovereign to rule over them, right? Man needs a government to rule over them. He believed that man needed a government in order to institute law and order within society, right? If you think about the word sovereign, all that means is the ability to rule. Man needs something to rule over them to maintain order within society. So John Locke is one that you really want to be familiar with. Locke and Hobbes differ because Locke thought that man is innately good. John Locke believed that when men are born, they are what's known as a tabula rasa. That's a Latin term that means blank slate, right? So it's kind of like the whole nature-nurture theory. Y'all familiar with that from sociology, right? You know, you're nurtured, you're brought up, and you're surrounding the people that you know, the people that you interact with on a daily basis, the way your mama, your daddy, grandma, grandpa, whoever raised you, that's going to define who you are versus nature, right? The whole genetic argument. Well, they were born that way. Okay, poor Lady Gaga. All right, so he saw that man was innately good. Man is a tabula rasa, and it's their society, it's man's surroundings that influence them. So therefore, if we can influence the surroundings that influence man, man can be innately good. All right? If you jump down here to where it talks about 2 treaties on civil government, he believed that all government should be based on people's natural rights. Okay? This whole idea right here of life, liberty, and property. Does that sound familiar to you at all? Life, liberty, and property? Okay, put that one in the back of your mind, and we're going to revisit that here in just a little bit, that concept, okay? Now, John Locke, and this is important, and we'll come back to this as well, okay? Right here, John Locke believed that government was essentially a contract, and I'll talk about this with Jean-Jacques Rousseau as well. Okay, there's something called the social contract, and you need to be familiar with that term, all right? The social contract. Y'all ready for this? This is getting real philosophical. We're talking like way high order fancy thinking here. Y'all with me? Okay. The social contract says that government is a contract between the people who rule, the people who are in power, and the people to whom they rule over. All right? Let's break that down, because that's fancy people speak. All right? We don't like to be that fancy in here. The reason why the United States government has power is because we say that it has power. Y'all follow me there? Okay? Do I have the right to freedom of speech? Absolutely, right? The government, under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, will protect that right. Do I have the right to yell fire in a crowded theater? Why? No, I hear no, why?
Because
it endangers other people, right? The Supreme Court case Shemp versus the United States, but you don't need to know that, all right? So you don't have the right to do that because it endangers other people, okay? So I have to give up my right to yell fire in a crowded theater because it endangers other people, but if I do that, the government protects the rest of my rights to freedom of speech. Do you see that? All right? I have to give up as a United States citizen some of my rights. Maybe the right to decide what to do with my entire paycheck because I have to pay taxes, right? Or the right to what to do on some days because I have to do jury duty if I'm called for that, right? There are some things that I as a citizen have to do. But in turn, the government, the United States government, protects the rest of my rights. You know, religion, assembly, speech, press, petition, the right to bear arms, no quartering of troops, protection of my person's papers and possessions. All right, all those different things that are in the Bill of Rights. So you have your rights, right, and you give up a few of them, and the government in turn protects the rest of those rights. I think the recording stopped there. Pause for just a moment, but that's cool. All right, so think about how different this is. In a monarchy, how does the government get power?
The king.
The king, right? Where does the king get his power from? From the big man upstairs, right? The king and the king's family, they're ultimately the ruling family because they have that divine appointment to be the king. And if somebody else wants to be king, then you have to go in and fight a war and all that stuff, right? Well, that's the way it's always been. Now people are saying, like John Locke, that the government gets its power from the people to whom they rule over. Completely different, all right? That's the social contract theory. So make sure that you're familiar with that. We'll talk about that a little bit more with Rousseau as well. Montesquieu's fun. We see Montesquieu in our government every single day, all right? Montesquieu was a French guy, and for that we'll forgive him, all right, because he came up with this great idea. He was influenced by John Locke's writing, and he wrote a pamphlet called The Spirit of Laws. And he said, essentially, that all government has three essential powers, and this isn't up there, so you need to know this, okay? Montesquieu said that all government has three essential powers. It has an executive power, it has a legislative power, and it has a judicial power. Okay? Let's break that down even farther. It has a power to make laws. Civics 101, and I'll talk about this, and this was even an easy question on the NC final exam last year, right? What is the job of the legislative branch of government? To make law. That's it. All right? All government has the power to make law. All government has the power to enforce the law, and all government has the power to interpret that law. Do we see Montesquieu in our government? Where do we see him?
Law enforcement?
Okay. Yeah,
Does it first all go with executive?
it does. Yeah, executive enforces, legislative makes, judicial interprets. And we'll talk about that a lot in here. You'll get tired of me saying that, all right? But how many branches of government do we have? Three. What are they? Judicial, legislative, and executive.
Whoa!
Whoa! There it was. All right, Montesquieu is in our Constitution. These philosophes, these French and English thinkers, we said, you know what? That's a brilliant idea. I'm going to take a little bit of that and put it in my Constitution because that's a good idea. We also have this idea of checks and balances within government. You probably want to write that down as well, right? Checks and balances within government. What am I talking about when I'm talking about checks and balances? Can the Supreme Court declare a law unconstitutional? Yes. All right. They gave themselves that power. We'll talk about that. That one's fun. Marbury versus Madison, right? So a judicial branch can declare a law unconstitutional. Who gets to determine how many judges are on the Supreme Court? Congress does. Our legislative branch does, right? Can the president veto a law? Yeah, he can. Absolutely, since day one, right? So if Congress passes a law and the president doesn't like it, he can refuse to sign it or he can outright deny it, right? So there's a check on the legislative branch, right? All of our federal government, we'll get it more into that in Unit 2 when we talk about national government, but we have this system of checks and balances in our government to make sure that one branch of government doesn't become too powerful. Guess what? There's Montesquieu again. Any questions on that? All three branches of government have power. But they have different types of power, different responsibilities. And we'll talk about that again. That's more Unit 2. Okay? We're just kind of trying to understand the thinking behind that. So when we get to that, you'll be, oh, I see Montesquieu. I see Rousseau. And we'll bring them up again, right? Because these are fun deadline guys. All right? So, as opposed to not, I don't know. All right, so we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote, his landmark work is called The Social Contract. And we already mentioned the social contract theory. And on the last test that I saw, they talked about Locke with social contract theory. So just either way, as long as you know what social contract is, you're going to be fine. Okay? And again, that's the idea that we have to give up some of our rights, and the government in turn protects the rest of our rights. Okay. So we've already made a few connections between the Enlightenment and founding documents, which guarantee you when we start talking about founding documents, Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, Constitution, Bill of Rights, all that, we'll make those connections some more, all right? So these writings were not specific just to England. People like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson were reading Locke's work, Rousseau's work, the Baron de Montesquieu, Thomas Hobbes. And it was influencing what they were saying, right? And we'll look at part of the Declaration of Independence here in just a moment to really make that connection. Okay? There was one other guy. We're going to talk about him more when we get into economics. But there's this dude by the name of Adam Smith. And I'm just going to kind of deviate from the path here. Dude by the name of Adam Smith. What is Adam Smith famous for? Something in economics. Okay, the invisible hand theory, which says that if you don't touch the business cycle, if you don't touch the market, ultimately we're going to come back to equilibrium. You're exactly right. Now, Adam Smith was interesting because he came up with his theories. He was inspired by trade between the colonies and between England. Smith is an American guy, right? And he would watch the ships go in and out, and he would watch the trade and this whole idea of mercantilism. And that's where he came up with his economic theories. But just to kind of put him under this umbrella as well of the Enlightenment. Okay? But his economic thinking, and when we compare Adam Smith to somebody like John Maynard Keynes in the 1940s and look at the difference in thinking even from then on. So just to kind of bring it all together, you have the Enlightenment, which is a period of shifting away from religion to human reason, right? We're going to figure it out. We're going to institute governments that are not run by a monarchy. We're going to institute governments that get their power from the people who govern, to whom they govern. We have people like John Locke, who believed that people have natural rights, and those natural rights are life, liberty, and property, right? He believed with Rousseau, the social contract theory, which says that we give up some of our rights and the government in turn protects the rest of those rights. There's people like the Baron de Montesquieu, who believes that all government has three essential powers: executive, legislative, and judicial, so that there can be a check and a balance between that, and that no branch of government becomes too powerful. So that is like a down and dirty intro to the Enlightenment. You'll read a little bit more about them, and we'll make a few more connections to help it make a little bit more sense.